I want to get more into the special prosecution force and Judge Sirica, who just operated completely unethically and very corrupt. So, following, once the prosecution ramps up, this what you call, I mean, it's really a partisan army of special prosecutors are recruited, and you say they have the main goal of just taking Nixon down.
Yes,
So
that's what I
how
say.
so
You
how
perfectly understand my argument.
yeah, so how is this special prosecution force recruited, assembled? What are their political motives? How are they how are they acting with secrecy and corruption and all this stuff?
Let us go to the beginning. We'll start at the very beginning. Do, re,
Okay.
mi. Okay.
Okay.
Uh, on April 30th, 1973, Nixon announces the resignations of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, and his decision to appoint Elliot Richardson to succeed Kleindienst as Attorney General. Uh, Elliot Richardson held lots of positions in the Nixon administration and lots of positions in Massachusetts before he got there. A liberal Republican, he'd been U.S. Attorney, been Lieutenant Governor, been Attorney General of Massachusetts. He was Undersecretary of State. He was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He'd just been confirmed as Secretary of Defense. He had the perfect resume to someday run for president. He was also totally uninvolved in Watergate.
Mhm.
So Nixon wanted him to be a totally clean Attorney General. We're going to play this thing straight.
All right.
Richardson wanted no part of it because he would have to choose which prominent Republicans to prosecute. He didn't want the job, but Nixon prevailed upon him. So, in the course of the confirmation hearings, controlled by Senator Kennedy, the Senate Judiciary Committee made certain demands. They demanded that there be a special prosecutor and that they create from scratch a Watergate special prosecution force. And what they negotiated with Elliot Richardson was a proposed regulation that is nicknamed the guidelines for this newly created special prosecution force. Now, come forward 50 years, there's a prosecutor down in Florida and in Washington, D.C., who's prosecuting Trump. And the judge down in Florida said, you're not prosecuting him under any statute, and you haven't been confirmed by the Senate, so you're not a lawfully appointed prosecutor. Go back 50 years, that's what they did. We didn't challenge it at the time. Same exact thing. At the behest of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Elliot Richardson agreed to a set of guidelines that provided total independence for a special prosecution force, and he agreed to appoint a head whom the committee approved. Okay, he wasn't confirmed.
Mhm.
And he picks his labor law lawyer from Harvard Law School, a guy named Archibald Cox.
Yep.
Cox comes up with Richardson, is subject to the hearing. They approve Richardson. Richardson gets sworn in. He appoints Cox special prosecutor. Cox's first appointment is a fellow Harvard law professor named James Vorenberg, who does teach criminal law. And Vorenberg takes it upon himself to do all the hiring for Archie and to take notes of developments during the course of their existence so he could write the report when they were through. Okay?
Mhm.
So he hires against a budget that was extracted from the Department of Justice, from within, not an act of Congress, from within the Department of Justice, that envisions 92 newly hired employees. Okay, the table of organization and employment, 92 slots. They didn't announce this. And then he sets about hiring. And there isn't time to do full field investigations or FBI clearances, so he only hires his friends or friends of friends. They happen to be people who went through Harvard Law School because that's where he teaches, that's where he's from.
Right.
When the smoke cleared, and the previous Department of Justice under Kennedy and Johnson,
Yep.
when the smoke clears, the top 17 officers or attorneys in the Watergate Special Prosecution Force all worked for the Kennedy Johnson Department of Justice. Okay, so what you have is a constitutional inversion. The people who lost power when Nixon was elected in 68, the Democrats, are now back in charge of the administration that beat them, and they have the sole investigatory and prosecution power. So they announce at their first press conference they're going to investigate every single allegation of wrongdoing made against the Nixon administration since it assumed office in 1969. This is not Watergate. Okay? This is everything we can throw you at. We're
Right.
going to interpret the law. This is lawfare. We're
Yeah.
going to aggressively reinterpret the law to wipe you guys out. And they hire most of the middle-aged, mid-career gunslingers. Many of them come out of the Southern District of New York, where they made their bones prosecuting the mob. And they treat the Nixon White House the same way you treat the mob. We'll just pressure you till you break. We don't care what we do to your family. This was a criminal enterprise. You had motive because you were for Nixon. You had ability because you worked in the White House. If you mislicked a stamp, we're going to get you. And the bottom group of people, the younger people, my age, they were all people who hated Nixon because of the Vietnam War. So
Yeah.
we have, and then we invited Archibald Cox to leave in an event called the Saturday Night Massacre. Okay.
Right. Yep.
They bring in a new special prosecutor. The special prosecutor's name is Leon Jaworski.
Yep.
And the group that Vorenberg had recruited, these are all Harvard or Ivy League lawyers, hate Nixon. They titled their phone directory the best and the brightest. They called themselves Cox's Army. And when we fired Archibald Cox, they adopted a scorched earth prosecution policy. We're going to take out everybody. And Jaworski, who comes in, actually writes his deputy and says, I can't work with this staff. This staff is holding meetings before they come to see me to discuss an issue, so I only get one point of view. And I've warned you about this before, but there's this undercurrent that the president must be reached at all costs. That's in writing, Jake, in a memo he wrote his deputy. Now, what happened, the three top prosecutors take their records with them. So we didn't know about any of this stuff. And the stuff didn't start to surface until just the last 10 years. So now we have written paper trail of wrongdoing. We have secret meetings, secret memos, secret coordination by and between individuals in all three branches of government that were going to take Nixon down by any means, fair or foul. The surprising thing is they left this paper trail, and I got the paper trail.
Yeah, I'm no expert in criminal justice or law or anything, but it seems to me that when you're prosecuting or any sort of courtroom issues, the objective should be to get to the truth, right? It seems to
Well,
me that their sole goal wasn't to get to the truth. I mean, they were sort of making up their own reasons for why Nixon was guilty just to get Nixon.
let's go to today, just briefly. And I know nothing about today except what I read in the newspapers. There are
Right.
5 pending cases against Trump: Florida, Georgia, New York, and Washington, D.C. And it looks like the top prosecutor from the Department of Justice somehow ends up for a local DA in New York to go after Trump. It looks like the lead prosecutor in Georgia comes and meets with White House counsel in Washington, D.C. So people suspect that there may be coordination by and between these groups. What's interesting, when you go back 50 years, it's not a suspicion. We have a paper trail. I've uncovered the paper trail. Picture a triangle, okay? Each of the three angles represents one branch of government. Mm-hmm. Just say the top one is the executive branch. I can prove to you through official papers kept at the National Archives that the prosecutors were meeting with the judges and on at least 10 occasions, and they wrote down what they talked about and what they would have concluded and where that was going to go. Go down to one of the lower angles, say on the right side. There are three judges, three federal judges, and I can prove they met secretly the prosecutors. Okay? Judge Sirica, who appointed himself to preside, Judge Gazette, who handled the Plumbers trials, and Circuit Court Judge David Bazelon. And then on the other side, there's the legislative branch. You've got the Senate Judiciary Committee that confirmed Richardson, the Senate Ervin Committee, which is just like the J6, and the House Judiciary Committee that handled Nixon's impeachment. Now, let me make two more observations, then we'll go back. The Ervin Committee is very much like the J6 Committee today. A majority of Democrats. Nixon had no defender on the committee. Lowell Weicker, one of the nominal Republicans, said the only reason he joined was to sink Nixon. And they only investigated the 72 campaign, not 68, not 64, my God, not 60. The J6 committee has the same thing. Nominal Republicans, but no Trump supporters. We're not going to investigate why there was no security. We're not going to investigate why these people are going crazy, arresting and prosecuting 1,300 individuals. Why were there no fences? Why was there? Trump offered 10,000 National Guard troops. Why not? Well, because the Democrats don't want to know. Go back to the judges. This is you'll love this story. Archibald Cox, the first special prosecutor, becomes so concerned that Judge Sirica is making so many pro-prosecution rulings that they'll win at trial, but they'll get reversed on appeal because the defendants didn't receive the due process of law guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment. So he goes to see the chief judge of the appellate panel, his friend, in secret. And he says, you know, Sirica's really out on the wild side. So we don't want you guys to reverse. And here's how you can do it. You can stack the deck of the judges on appeal to make sure Sirica's never reversed. Now, that appeals court, the D.C. Circuit, throughout Watergate had only 9 judges, just like the Supreme Court, but only 9 judges. 5 of whom were very, very liberal and controlled by the chief judge. 4 of whom were not liberal. There were a couple conservative Democrats and a couple of Nixon appointees. Mm-hmm. On any standard 3-judge panel, which is what you get on an appeal, statistically, you could end up with 2 Republicans. And they might reverse Sirica. Well, they would be big trouble. But if the appeals were heard by the full court all at once, unprecedented, but if we did it that way, the 5 liberals would always prevail. That's what you should do. And sure enough, in all 12 criminal appeals from Judge Sirica's cases, they're heard by the 9-judge panel. It's called sitting en banc from the outset. And in Latin, because we love Latin, it's called sua sponte en banc. From the beginning, all 9 judges, and amazingly, Sirica's upheld in all the cases. Why do we, aside from the fact it's self-evident, this has never been done before or since in any circuit court in our nation's history. There's
Right.
another reason we know. That's because Bazelon's law clerk was in the room at the time Cox called on Bazelon. And he told one person years later of this terrible wrong.
Yep.
That person was a partner in his law firm who was about to be sworn in to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. That person happened to be Deputy Attorney General during Watergate, and my good friend, Judge Larry Silberman, recently passing away. And Silberman told me of this conversation. I remember where we were and when it was, and it was in the lobby of a club, and I said, "My God, that's the missing link." And because what he said was, "Can you imagine the much vaunted Archibald Cox of the Harvard Law School privately calling on the chief judge of the very panel that's going to review his cases?" And I said, "Well, that's the missing link." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I can show Sirica did all these crazy things, but he's always upheld on appeal. Now I know why." And Larry said, "You can't quote me. I'm already controversial enough. This is a private conversation." And I worked, that was 2008. And I worked for the next 14 years trying to convince him to allow me to say this. And we even went back to look at the clerk's records of how it came about. Larry said, you can't just meet en banc because the chief judge wants you to. There has to be a vote. There has to be a discussion. And he asked the clerk for the record from years before. Clerk reported back there was no record. Astonishing, there was no record. And then, as Larry got toward the end of his life, he suggested to me, when my third book, the one there by your right hand, when that came out, I went to see Larry and asked for some help in publicizing it. And he said, "You should put on a seminar for the Federalist Society and with all that you've uncovered." And I said, "Will you participate?" And he looks off in the distance and he says, "Yes, I will participate in your seminar." And just before we did the seminar, we did it about a year ago, it's on tape. He says, "Now, let's go over what you want me to say during this discussion, in addition to that Bazelon meeting." And he'd flipped. He wanted that on record, this story of how the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit corrupted the appellate's process in Watergate. So what you've got: secret meetings, secret memos, secret coordination by and between all three branches with a paper trail that proves it. Now, maybe 50 years from today, we'll find out there was secret coordination against Trump, but we now know it, secret coordination against Nixon and his top people. You know, if you're going to have a fair trial, you need a fair and objective judge. Sirica was neither fair nor objective. You need even-handed, nonpartisan prosecutors. They were neither even-handed nor were they nonpartisan. You need a jury pool that's untainted by adverse pretrial publicity and unbiased politically, and we had neither. And you need an appellate court that is equally fair and objective, and we had none of those things. And we now know it. So you ask, what's going to come from this? What's the outcome? What's the therefore?
Yeah.
I've got 3 books. I've done a documentary that summarizes this and shows it. And I've got all these documents laid out in detail on my website. I mean, you can go every single document I've mentioned. And I've also, I turned for just a second, I've put together a spiral-bound notebook of the 24 most egregious internal memos that we prepared for a presentation that we did at the Hoover Institution out at Stanford. So we've got the full records. we're thinking there might be a change in management at the Department of Justice after the next election. We've already asked this Department of Justice to look into this corruption from 50 years ago. Documented corruption, wrongdoing in the biggest criminal case, political case in our nation's history. And they've turned us down. They've said, no, we won't even look. They didn't say we looked and there's nothing there. They said, we don't think this is important enough for us to look at all. Well, if you got a new Department of Justice, new management, and they said, we think you really ought to take a look. I mean, look what this guy's uncovered. We believe the Department of Justice would be forced to come into court and disown those convictions. The other thing we want, Jake, is really unique to Richard Nixon. When they brought out the cover-up indictments on March 1st, 1974, they named Nixon an unindicted co-conspirator. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's separate from the roadmap, separate from going up to the Hill to get impeached. They said that he was a co-conspirator, that they could prove his involvement. 2018, when I finally got the roadmap unsealed, turned out they didn't have the proof, they didn't have the allegation, done in secret. We want to know what Leon Jaworski told the grand jury to convince the grand jury to name Nixon a co-conspirator. We don't think he had any specific allegation. We don't think it's there. But that's been hidden for 55 years. We've never been able to learn that. We asked for it when the allegation first came out, when the Nixon was named. They said, no, it's got to be secret. That's grand jury. We asked for it 30 years later when they unsealed Nixon's grand jury testimony. And we asked for it when I got the roadmap unsealed in 2018. The other half of my petition said, we want to see what Jaworski said. And the department called me up and said, you know, Geoff, you won on the roadmap, but we've been asked to prepare the order declining disclosure of the grand jury. And I said, well, that's no fair. This is not witness testimony. This is what they said. Said, we're sorry. This is where the judge is. And I said, what if I withdraw the motion? They said, okay, we'll let you do that. We'll say this part has never been decided. So we could go back to the Department of Justice after January 20th, 2025, and say, we want you to arrange for unsealing of this testimony. If we were to prevail, I believe to the very bottom of my soul, there was no specific allegation of wrongdoing against Nixon. I think Jaworski went in and said, we've given you this evidence over the past 2 months. We now are asking you to vote. And they never, ever specified what the action was, the personal action that Nixon was alleged to have created.
Well, I hope you do prevail, because that would, answer a lot of questions. But to sum up here, you have the special prosecution force. They're secretly meeting with the judge. They're not revealing critical information like the roadmap to the defense team. So the defense team doesn't even know what they're accusing Nixon of. They're rigging the appeals process to have all 9 judges from the D.C. court on appeal as opposed to the regular 3, because Sirica is oftentimes overturned. And what's crazy to me is they write this all down.
Yeah.
How do they not? How does this not blow up in their face?
We call that hubris. This overweening pride that goeth before the fall. Jaworski in particular, these are self-dictated memos to his file describing his secret meetings with a judge.
Yeah.
And was it that he knew he was going to write a book and he was keeping contemporary notes? Was it he wanted this stuff to come out, but not when he was still alive? Was it that he was so proud of his own actions, he wanted that to be recorded?